You scared? You should be. Fear, terror, horror. It's what we want when we go to see these movies. Movies with monsters, ghosts, ghouls, zombies, serial killers, aliens, skeletons, and the supernatural. It's an adrenaline rush as you're watching, not sure what will happen next. But when watching one of these movies, do you really want to know what happens next? The answer? Oh yes. Which is why you watch. Now watch with us as we present the history of horror films. The horror film genre dates back to the 1800s. The genre is almost as old as film itself. In 1895, Georges Méliès acquired a film camera after watching a demonstration of a device created by the Lumiere brothers. Sometimes known as the Cinemagician, Méliès would go on to make dozens of films, usually only a few minutes long. He got his nickname from his experiments with substitution, multi-exposure, time-lapse, dissolves, and hand-coloring his film. In short, Georges Méliès was a pioneer in special effects. In 1896, Méliès would release, with a grand total running time of 2 minutes, the silent film Le Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil, on December 24, 1896, in the theater Robert Houdin in Paris. The film takes place in a medieval castle where the devil uses a cauldron to summon skeletons, ghosts, ghouls, and witches. The film was not meant to be terrorizing. It was meant to amuse people more than scare them. Even so, this is still hailed as the first horror film. In his large credit of films, Méliès would also make another horror film called La Caverne Maudite, which titled The Cave of the Demons. It literally translated into The Accursed Cave. The horror genre would pick up in speed as other cultures began to experiment with film. The first films of any kind to come out of Japan were two short horror films, Big Jizo, Jizo the Spook, and Shinin no Sisei, Resurrection of a Corpse. Both films were made in 1898. The first full-length featured film to feature a monster was the 1906 film Esmeralda, based on the author Victor Hugo's book Notre Dame in Paris. Most commonly known in the United States as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was remade after Esmeralda 3 times in 1909, 1910, and 1911. The film featured the creature Quasimodo, who, while not the monster we depict in modern-day horror, was frightening to the audiences due to his irregular facial and body features.
It wasn't until 1919 that horror solidified itself as one of the primary film genres. One of the most influential films was made by German director Robert Wiene. His film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, was the first to make use of the sets to create suspense, using things like cramped rooms, lopsided doors, twisty alleyway to help tell the story. The cinematography would later influence horror films of the 1930s. The oldest and most well-known vampire film is the German-made Nosferatu, a symphony of horror filmed in 1921, starring Max Schreck as the vampiric Count Orlok. The film is a retelling of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. The movie, along with the main characters, was renamed because the studio was unable to procure the rights to the novel. In the 1930s, Universal Pictures gave birth to the icons of horror, four beings that to this day are synonymous with the term: Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and the Mummy.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
In 1931, Dracula was a commercial success as the film played upon fears of sexuality, blood, and shadowy point between life and death.
I am Dracula.
Bela Lugosi, with his heavy accent, was incredibly smooth, elegant, and exotic in his portrayal of the 500-year-old vampire. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, Dracula is the most frequently portrayed character in horror films, with more than 160 depictions. A little known fact, Bela Lugosi was afraid of blood and would faint at the sight of it. During the same year, the gothic horror Frankenstein came out. This was the first film to portray the character of the mad scientist. The first Frankenstein monster to be made on film was by Thomas Edison's studio in 1910, but none was more memorable than James Whale's adaptation starring an unknown at the time, Boris Karloff. Karloff's portrayal of the boxy-headed monster with electrodes attached to his neck was phenomenal, bringing life to the pathetic creature with his lumbering and lurching gait. It was in 1935 that the US first made a film about a werewolf titled The Werewolf of London, but it wasn't until 1941 that the most remembered werewolf was made. Universal's The Wolfman starred Lon Chaney Jr. as the definitive werewolf. The movie, while considered B-grade, was praised on its incredible realistic and complicated transformation sequence. Finally, the fourth icon to grace the silver screen, The Mummy in 1932. Returning to Universal as the title star was Boris Karloff as the 3,700-year-old mummy, once again making his second monster role a success. Universal will go on to make 3 sequels to The Mummy, with The Mummy's Tomb 1942, The Mummy's Ghost, and The Mummy's Curse in 1944. While The Mummy was one of the living dead, he wasn't a true zombie. Zombies, as flesh-eating mindless creatures, were first depicted as we know them today in 1932 movie White Zombie, starring Dracula's star Bela Lugosi. Whereas this was the first zombie movie, it wouldn't be made definitive until 1968 with George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Sometimes overshadowed by 4 big icons, which is strange considering how big he is. King Kong was also a classic put out in 1933. The horror genre will stay more or less the same until the 1960s, with the film Psycho, by masterful suspense director Alfred Hitchcock, which will go on to give birth to the subgenre slasher films.